right, so welcome everyone. As many of you know, but some may not, I'm Sam Goldman. I'm Executive Director of the Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom, and it's with great pleasure that I welcome this evening Shadi Hamid, who will discuss religion, freedom, and the Trump administration 1 year in. Before I introduce Shadi, I just want to encourage you to move to the front. There's no reason to be shy or perch in the back. There are plenty of seats closer to the podium. We are all friends here, and your proximity will encourage a lively discussion, such as I hope to have. So thank you to those of you who have moved in. Shadi has a very impressive bio, and I won't read all of it, but just some highlights. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing editor at The Atlantic. He is author of Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, which was shortlisted for the 2017 Lionel Gelber Prize for Best Book on Foreign Affairs. He is also co-editor of a new book, only recently released, is that right? Rethinking Political Islam, which was published by Oxford University Press. His first book, Temptations of Power, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East, was named a Foreign Affairs Best Book of 2014. And before coming to Washington, he served as Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center. He received his BS and master's degree from Georgetown's School of Foreign Service and his PhD in political science from Oxford University. So you have a youthful appearance, and I'm going to guess that you are certainly no older than I am, and having myself struggled to complete only one book, I am deeply impressed and somewhat ashamed to introduce the author of, shall we say, 2.5. So, Shadi, thank you for coming, and I will turn over the podium to you.
Thank you, Sam, for the kind introduction. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to you and Anel for organizing. And thanks to all of you for coming. I know just some papers and work, so I appreciate you being here. So there's quite a lot I want to cover, and it's a pretty we have some big issues in the title. So religion, freedom,
the Trump administration,
and the Trump administration. So 3 very big things to deal with 1 year in. So let me just get right to it, and I'll start here at home, and then I'll move a little bit abroad towards the Middle East on these questions of the role of religion in public life, religious freedom, and Trump, in kind of the moment that we're living in under the Trump administration. So I guess a lot of you, or some of you, are probably familiar with the TV series The Handmaid's Tale. So I thought I'd just start with that as a point of reference in terms of sort of situating our conversation. And anyway, I'll give, for those of you who have not seen it, it's about a hypothetical theocratic totalitarian state in the US. So it's sort of a dystopian series based on Margaret Atwood's book from, I guess, 1984, when it was published, or somewhere around that time. So, but pretty much when the show came out, a lot of people, or at least some people on the left, were saying, well, could this actually happen here? And sort of using the figure of Mike Pence and the movement that he represents, evangelicals and Christian conservatives more generally, that could there possibly be greater restrictions on, say, women, and gender issues are a major theme of the book for those of you who have seen the show. So that's one way of looking at it, that let's say that sort of there's a resurgence of Christian religiosity in the US as represented by people like Mike Pence. The other way of looking at it in this current moment is that we did elect, I would argue, the most secular president possibly in American history. The most secular, but also perhaps the most irreligious president in US history, and certainly in recent US history. So these are two ways of looking at the current moment. Are we sort of, can we sort of envision a sort of dystopian, more theocratically influenced government versus, hey, we just voted for someone who doesn't seem to care much about religion at all. And we're also, I think, at a time when authors like Ross Douthat, the New York Times columnist, have been talking about a post-Christian society. And I would say that I find myself more in that camp of being skeptical of the kind of theocratic alarmism, let's say, that we see in some quarters on the left. Also, a couple of other authors have even gone further, I would say, than Ross Douthat, and have essentially said that Christian conservatives have lost the culture war in the US, and that they have to resign themselves to that fate and sort of embark on a strategic retreat. The person who's probably most well known and associated with this view is the author Rod Dreher, who writes a popular blog for the American Conservative. His new book, which came out a few months ago, is called The Benedict Option, where he essentially lays out his vision for retreating from the mainstream culture and essentially forming intentional communities of Christian observance that kind of go against the grain, against what he considers to be the secularizing influences of mainstream American society. So it's interesting that we're having a lot of these, I think, quite fascinating debates right now, and I think Trump has sort of brought some of those debates to the fore. Are we moving away from religion, moving towards religion? Is it something else? And that's part of what I'll try to address. And I think for those of us, and as someone who works on the role of religion in public life, but mostly abroad, I think for those of us who come from a more secular background, who are born and raised here in the US, when we hear about a post-Christian society or a more aggressively secularizing influence, our sort of initial impulse might be to see this as a positive thing, that Christianity or religion more generally in the US is playing, relatively speaking, less of a role today than it might have been a decade ago or several decades ago. But I would want to sort of challenge that assumption or that starting premise and offer a different way of looking at it, of situating the role of religion in public life. That, obviously religion playing a role in public life can be negative, and we see any number of examples of that both at home and abroad. But religion doesn't necessarily always play a negative role. Religion can also play a constructive role in any number of ways. And I think it's worth sort of reminding ourselves of that in terms of, and historically in terms of building new states, of forging group solidarity, and obviously many successful empires of the past were religious in orientation, including the various Islamic empires and caliphates. And I think also this sort of fits into a broader discussion about what binds societies together. Where do people, or where do citizens or members of a particular community, and that could be a local community or on the national level of a state, what kind of identity do they share with their fellow citizens or their fellow members of a given community? So you need something, and that can be a religion, an ideology, a sense of citizenship. But, and this is where I think the idea that some of you may have heard about from the 14th century historian Ibn Khaldun, the idea of asabeya, which is an Arabic word, which doesn't quite have an exact equivalent in English, but I guess the closest translation would be group consciousness, or another word that's used is solidarity to describe this, but it goes a little bit deeper than that. And every society needs an asabeya. And it's just a question of what that will look like in any given society. But when we talk about the decline of Christianity in the West, certainly in Europe and to some extent here in the US, it sort of gets us into a kind of be careful what you wish for situation, because I would posit to you that with the decline of mainstream American Christianity, there has been an ideological vacuum left. And we find ourselves in a time where people are having very interesting and challenging conversations about, if you take my premise, about what might actually fill that ideological vacuum here in the US, but also in Europe. So it's be careful what you wish for, because one of the things that's filled the vacuum is something which we weren't paying a lot of attention to just 4 or 5 or 10 years ago, and that is, we can describe it as white nationalism, white nativism, white identity politics, ethno-nationalism, populist conservatism, nationalist conservatism. Any number of these phrases could be used to describe the movement which is associated with Donald Trump, and particularly his former chief strategist, Steve Bannon. And it's an interesting counterfactual of, if Christianity had stayed more relevant, not just among evangelicals or not just in certain parts of the country, but more broadly, could this white nativism have played as much of a role and as much of a divisive role as it's currently playing? So, and if we want to sort of compare from the present day to, say, several decades ago, even people who weren't that observant or practicing Christians, say, in the 40s or 50s, or even more recently, there was still a kind of nominal Christian identity that was shared, even among people who weren't particularly practicing or observant. But now we have a situation where large swaths of the country, including in particular on the left, including in particular in the Democratic Party, where religion simply doesn't factor in. And it's interesting that if you look at what the Democratic Party has been emphasizing, or its recent political platforms, after a sort of initial effort on the part of Obama, when he was running the first time around, to reach out to people of faith and to use a kind of language of faith that could resonate with people, the Democratic Party sort of gave up on that, in particular in the last election, where it was certainly not a major or even close to major theme of Hillary Clinton's campaign. So in that sense, we've become more stratified in how we talk about religion. And actually, a few months ago, I was doing work at a coffee shop, and this really struck me, and maybe some of you have had similar experiences. While I was sitting there with my laptop, 2 people were sitting having coffee, and as they said goodbye to each other, they did a prayer out loud, a Christian prayer. And as someone who's, has been around religious people, but mostly Muslims, in terms of my work in the Middle East, I'm not as used to seeing sort of outward Christian displays, especially here in DC, in the bastions of Northeastern elite liberalism. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, this feels very out of place. It's not something, yes, maybe in other parts of the country that would be considered quite normal, but it's not something that we're used to seeing here in DC or in New York, and the places that I think a lot of us, well, we're here, so the places that a lot of us have ended up spending time in. And I'll also just recount another, I follow, some of you are also probably on Twitter, or at least lurk on Twitter, and there's one person in particular in the sort of journalist policy scene in DC who actually, only one person I can think of who identifies as Christian explicitly in her Twitter bio, and she's one of my favorite writers actually. But it's interesting that the first time I saw her Twitter bio, I had a similar sense that that's actually very rare if you look at sort of the writers, authors, journalists, policy people who aren't explicitly known as kind of Christian evangelicals or Christian conservatives to actually identify as Christian, again, is relatively rare. But this is all just to say that that's the kind of, that's a sort of, that's one way of looking at the current moment we're living in, that there are obviously people who are still religiously conservative, but it's more divided along geographic lines and educational lines, more so than perhaps ever before. So on the left, or in the kind of, in liberal elite circles, to use the cliche, that doesn't mean that people aren't searching for meaning, but it's become more individualistic and not necessarily oriented around organized religion. But that still leaves a sort of vacuum if there isn't a shared identity that can kind of transcend our individual pursuits. And this is where I think the Trump moment becomes very interesting on both sides of the spectrum, where on the Democratic side, and I wrote a piece about this recently in the Atlantic, the title was The Political Thrill of Having an Enemy. And I talked about how people on the left, in some weird way, have become happier since Trump was elected, which might seem counterintuitive because everyone was depressed, or pretty much everyone on the left was depressed on election day. But then something new, I think, sort of came out afterwards as people were making sense of what had happened, and it was a sense of renewed purpose, that there was something to fight for and struggle for and believe in, where there may not have been before. That sort of Obama and Hillary represent this kind of technocratic moment that has clearly passed us by, of kind of technocratic incrementalism, of sort of nudging in a better direction. The arc of history bends towards justice, but bends towards justice very slowly. And that was sort of the moment we were living in, where I think now on the Democratic side, there is a sense that quite a lot is at stake. And the normal policy conversations aren't really what are motivating people. It's more around what it means to be an American and what our particular American identity is about. So that's sort of, we can say, on the sort of Trump opponent side of the spectrum. And as I mentioned, on the sort of pro-Trump side of the spectrum, we have this ethno-nationalism, and we can kind of call it more generally Trumpism, if we want to sort of attribute a kind of intellectual orientation to it, so people can have a discussion about what does Trumpism without Trump look like? What does Trumpism after Trump look like? And this is where the ideas of European populism and European ethno-nationalism, I think, become more relevant. Now, let me now move a little bit towards so I've talked a little bit about Christianity. Let me talk a little bit about where Islam fits into all of this, since we're talking about religion more broadly. And I think that if you look at various populist movements, right-wing populist movements in the US, but also throughout Europe, it's interesting that they can be quite different from each other, and they're quite diverse in their own right. And so some of them are more libertarian, some of them are trying to outflank the left on social welfare policies and get disillusioned socialists, as in France. We have Catholic conservatives in Poland, we have Viktor Orban in Hungary, the list goes on. So they're different, but there's one connective thread that ties them together, including the white nativists or Trumpists here in the US, and that is a fear of and opposition to Islam and Muslims. So this is intriguing because in these countries, France, it kind of goes as high as 6% of the population, but in any of the other countries we're looking at, we're talking about between 1 and 4% of the population. And here in the US, it's around 1%, give or take. So how is it that these movements or parties can actually make opposition to Islam or Muslims a focal point of their entire political platform, to the extent that, especially in Europe, entire elections are oriented around these debates? So if you look at the French elections, the Danish elections, over the past year, that this almost becomes either the main dividing line between parties or one of the top 2 or 3 dividing lines. And it's interesting that my colleague Shadi Hamid, who has done polling on Christian evangelical and American attitudes more generally towards Islam, in some of his recent polling, his conclusion is that few things predict partisan affiliation in the US as starkly as attitudes towards Muslims and Islam. So again, this is sort of an odd thing. Why is it that if Muslims are only 1% of the American population, that attitudes towards them would sort of forge these very strong partisan affiliations and identities? Now, if we look at the US context, let's say if we look at the Republican coalition or the right of center coalition in the country, you know, it's not too surprising that white nativists would be suspicious of Islam because there are, you know, long-term demographic concerns. The idea, obviously, of domestic terrorism. These are all things that figure in. But it's not just Muslims. Muslims are also sort of lumped into a broader demographic challenge of brown people, including Hispanics, and that, you know, what happens when in 2050, you know, whites become, or whenever it might happen, depending on different projections, what happens when whites become a minority in their own country here in the US. And obviously there are already some states where that's happening. In California, for instance, where whites are already a minority. So there are obviously these demographic concerns, but there are also civilizational concerns. If you're talking about sort of white nationalists or ethno-nationalists. And this has to do with how do you define Western civilizational identity without having something to define yourself against. And this is where the idea of clash of civilizations and clash of values can become a strong motivating concern, to the extent that even in parts of the country where Muslims represent even less than 1% of the population, that there has been a whole kind of a series of anti-Muslim legislative initiatives, sort of these anti-Sharia planks that we see, including, you know, and it's odd. Why would people be freaking out about Sharia if Muslims are like 0.3% of a given locality or community? So this is an interesting development. But that's something that can bring together ethno-nationalist types and also Christian conservatives together, because they do share a fundamental concern around civilizational identity. Now, in the case of ethno-nationalists, obviously they emphasize the ethnic and the nationalist part of that more. In the case of Christian conservatives, the Christian or Judeo-Christian civilizational aspect can figure more prominently, but there is a kind of shared perspective. Now, and this is why, in part, despite white evangelicals initially being skeptical about Trump, they end up voting for Trump in unprecedented numbers, which again might seem counterintuitive, considering that, again, you know, here was someone who wasn't particularly godly or associated with religion. But this is where I think Trump was able to sort of employ civilizational concerns in a very effective way. And it's worth mentioning that, and this is something that Robert Jones talks about in his book, The End of White Christian America, how Trump was able to sort of portray this election as a last chance election. That this was the last chance for both whites and Christians, but particularly white Christians, to forestall demographic changes that will not be reversed, essentially. So there's one example of Trump. Trump was asked this. He was pretty much making the case. I'll just quote the block because it's interesting in a kind of Trumpian sort of way. But he says he's talking about this idea of this being the last election where it's possible to reverse the tide. So he says, quote unquote, "I think this will be the last election that the Republicans have a chance of winning, because you're going to have people flowing across the border, you're going to have illegal immigrants coming in, and they're going to be legalized, and they're going to be able to vote. And once that happens, you can forget it. So pretty explicit, and there's a kind of a poetic sensibility to that in a kind of very Trumpian way. But who was he saying this to? He was saying this, very interestingly enough, on the Christian Broadcasting Network to Pat Robertson, obviously the prominent Christian conservative figure. And this is where you see a kind of a natural overlap between and a response that really had nothing to do with religion, but feeds into a broader set of civilizational concerns. And it's also worth noting that when it comes to demographic issues, white Christians are already a minority in the US. So where they were 54% of the population at the start of Obama's first term, they are now 43% of the population. So we're seeing kind of a sort of striking shift. And this fear of becoming a minority, even if it might seem unreasonable or irrational to us, is becoming more relevant in the public debate. Now, if we kind of go to Europe, we also see less the kind of the Christian religious aspect of the civilizational concerns, and we see a more explicitly defined kind of both demographic and also kind of a fear of undoing the secular gains of Europe. And this is especially a prominent theme in the more avowedly secular countries like France, where there's a gap in religious observance, a very profound gap between French Muslims and French non-Muslims, for example. But it's interesting that there's a book that lays out the demographic possibilities. There's a lot of demographic alarmism in Europe, but there's a book that's particularly creative that it's by Michel Houellebecq, Submission, and has been translated into English. It's worth taking a look at, but it's very creative because essentially the scenario that he talks about, it's a novel, so is that in the year 2022, an Islamic party in France actually manages to win the French national elections after they form a coalition with the socialists. And they form a coalition with the socialists against Marine Le Pen and the National Front. So it is based, I guess, in some part of reality. So the president of France actually ends up being an Islamist named Mohammed Ben Abbas, and he starts implementing Sharia in France. And French nominal Christians go along with it for a variety of reasons, and in this sense it's somewhat fantastical. But it's a very interesting thought experiment, and it became a bestseller in France because it tapped into these real fears of being overrun by Muslims who are becoming a greater proportion of the population, but also have a stronger sense of religious identity than the sort of listless, secular, decadent French people. And there is some polling that would suggest that there are, as I mentioned, major gaps in religious identification in a country like France. And this is, I'll give you one example from a 2009 Gallup Coexist survey, where 58% of French Muslims either very strongly or extremely strongly identify with their religion, Islam, versus only 23% of French non-Muslims. So that's a massive gap of more than 30% of identification. And if we see attitudes towards homosexuality, towards gender issues, there are pretty significant gaps, again, according to whether someone is a French Muslim versus a French non-Muslim. So this raises a set of questions, certainly more so in Europe than here, because again, the proportion of Muslims in the US is very small, around 1%. So there's only so much that you can do with 1% of the population, even if you wanted to. But there is a question of down the road in countries like France, where in particular cities, you have, in some cases, 30, 40%, and it could increase down the road, of kind of Muslim populations in certain parts. So then what happens if in a particular town or city in 20 or 30 years, Muslims become a majority and are able to control local councils and city councils and so on. So it kind of gets to this question of how we conceptualize the tensions between religious conservatism and individual freedom in a very profound way, potentially, and it raises this question of how do liberal or secular or democratic societies in the West accommodate religious illiberalism. And when I'm talking here about religious illiberalism, I'm talking more about the sort of socially conservative form of illiberalism. And when I use the word liberal here, I'm talking about the classical liberal tradition, not so much the kind of American kind of common usage of liberal as being anyone on the left. But what happens if you have more religiously observant Muslims who are either less secular or less liberal compared to their fellow countrymen? And again, this would be more of an issue in Europe than here in the US, where Muslims in the US, for a variety of reasons, tend to be more and more closely associated with the Democratic Party and forming alliances, sort of intersectional alliances with other members of the Democratic coalition. So, and then I'll just shift this a little bit as I start to close up here towards the Middle East, because, you know, in the case of France, in this kind of dystopian scenario of an Islamist becoming the president of France, obviously this is very unlikely in countries where Muslims represent a minority. But of course, you know, we can talk about these tensions in a more stark fashion in the very places where Islamists have already come to power or will theoretically come to power in the future if there are free and fair elections in any number of Muslim majority contexts. And again, this is where we can actually play out some of these scenarios more closely and seriously of what happens when you have people who, in their conception of religious freedom, so you might say, well, and this gets to how we talk about religious freedom, where if Islamists come to power, they would say that their understanding of religious freedom includes restricting perhaps the individual freedoms of others when it comes to expressing secular ideas or things that are sinful. The obvious ones that we talk about for better or worse are things like alcohol consumption, gender segregation in public spaces, Islamic dress, so on and so forth, Islamizing aspects of social life, including education. So we actually do have examples of this, and it has led to, as many of you will know, very stark divides, foundational divides in these societies over the question of where does someone's religious freedom end and someone else's religious freedom begin. Now you might say that a solution to this problem is the classical liberal tradition, and this is often kind of proposed as a way to get around this problem of what happens if democratically elected conservative people want to infringe on the rights of minorities. And this could also obviously apply to certain parts of the US as well, and this is part of the debate around someone like Mike Pence when it comes to abortion and the right of women to make their own decisions about their own bodies, transgender issues, debates about gender more generally. The so-called Pence Rule is an interesting example because it actually, the first time I heard about the Pence Rule, so basically for those of you who don't know the Pence Rule, Mike Pence and others who sort of believe in this Pence Rule will not, there's two stipulations. One is they will not have a one-on-one meeting a one-on-one meeting with a member of the opposite sex, particularly in closed private environments, or they will not go to public functions where alcohol is being served, where there is mixed company. And I remember the first time I heard this, I thought to myself, this is exactly what Islamists support, but also conservative Muslims more generally. And I remember growing up, and there was a hadith that we used to hear in Sunday school. Pretty much the basic idea is that if a man and a woman are alone in a room, the the third is the shaitan, the third is the devil. So, and that's actually pretty much an almost exact rendering of at least part of the Pence Rule. So I don't want to just make this limited to questions about Islam's role in public life. Obviously, there are Christian conservatives who similarly are at odds again with the kind of broader secular culture and want to impose certain things. And again, abortion and gay rights would be the most obvious examples here in the US. So the solution to this problem is essentially to say that people cannot express that kind of religious freedom if it infringes on someone else's freedom. And this sort of is close to what we would call the harm principle of the classical liberal tradition. Now, the problem with offering this as a solution is that liberalism is not a neutral answer to the problem. Liberalism is only neutral to people who are already liberals. Now, that may be most of us in this room, and most Americans, at least up until recently, would identify with the classical liberal tradition. But not everyone in the world is a classical liberal or wants to be a classical liberal, and I would argue that we elected for the first time an illiberal Democrat as our president. So that does change the conversation a little bit when we're talking about democratically elected illiberal parties or candidates. So an Islamist would say that that is an infringement on the religious freedom if they can't ban alcohol, because they would say that that is fundamental to their conception of religiosity and to how they understand their faith and the requirement of their faith. So, but I would say that particularly in the case of Islam, it's also unrealistic to expect a kind of secularization or a privatization of faith. And this was actually the topic of my previous book, Islamic Exceptionalism, where I made the argument that Islam is actually distinctive from other religions, particularly Christianity, and how it relates to law, politics, and governance, and that Islam historically has proven to be more resistant to secularism and secularization, and we have to take those reasons seriously. And I made clear, and just to be clear about this, that that's not a negative, that's not a fundamentally negative comment about Islam. It's simply a descriptive comment about Islam, and some people might actually see that as being a very positive trait of Islam, that it is more resistant to privatization historically, but also theoretically, also theologically in terms of the founding moment of Islam and scriptural justifications and so on. So in that sense, it's sometimes unrealistic to expect religion to be privatized. And then the question then becomes, how do you accommodate religious illiberalism, even if it contradicts individual religious freedom? How do you find a balance? How do you manage those tensions in Muslim majority contexts, but also in Muslim minority contexts? And France is an example of this when it comes to burqa bans and bans on wearing burkinis. And that gets to, again, this question of where does someone's religious freedom end and begin, and where does the state, where can the state put limitations on the expression of religiosity in the public sphere? But I would just close and say that there's only one, I mean, obviously a longer conversation. We can kind of delve into this more if you'd like in the Q&A. But I guess, like, as I've been thinking more and more about these issues and managing these tensions, I've come to appreciate more and more small d democracy as sort of the most obvious way as a starting point. And obviously there are a lot of complex democratic theory and political theory conversations we could have about this, but democracy in the more minimalist sense, in the procedural sense, let's say more than the sort of substantive liberal democratic sense, that democracy allows different groups to contest and to disagree fundamentally about the good life, about what the good life looks like, peacefully, without resort to violence. But what that requires is that everyone who enters into the democratic arena respects democratic outcomes, even if those outcomes are seen to be personally threatening. And that's where I think it becomes more challenging, because democracy is always more easier to accept, first of all, if you know your side's going to win, but also if you know that your group, the group that you represent, won't be threatened in any kind of individual or communal sense. And this is where I think the Middle East has become a very interesting and important laboratory for what happens when you don't think you can win elections and you feel personally threatened, and therefore you support ending the democratic process. And it's interesting that debates that we used to have in the Middle East, I've noticed we've been having really for the first time in my own country here in the US, where people are essentially making, I would argue, anti-democratic arguments of, hey, is there a way that we can invoke the 25th Amendment, even though there's no real, at least in any plain reading of the US Constitution, and justification for invoking the 25th Amendment to, for example, get rid of Donald Trump as a democratically elected president. Also conversations around the Electoral College or impeachment in the absence of a clear sort of criminal case, and essentially politicizing impeachment to say, here's someone who we think in a subjective sense is unfit for government, and let's see if we can essentially get rid of him through an impeachment process, and so on and so forth. So these are examples of what happens when we have foundational divides and we start to feel that we can't, or we're not willing to respect democratic outcomes because so much is at stake. And in that sense, it can be about religion, it can be about ideology, it can be about race and ethnicity, and whether here in the US, Europe, or in the Middle East. I'll end there, and thank you.
So I will allow Shadi to call on his own questions. I just want to ask that when you are called on, you push the speaker button on the microphone before you. And when you've done that, the microphone will turn green. This allows us to record your question for posterity. So Shadi.
Okay, so I just go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and if you guys don't mind to just mention sort of your name and affiliation, so I have a sense of what people are up to.
Okay, so my name is Dan Schwartz. I teach Jewish history and direct Jewish studies here at GW. And I just want to first start by just complimenting you and your work. I really find it kind of like a refreshingly kind of countervailing voice to the conventional wisdom in academia. There's a kind of anti-essentialism in the study of religion that's almost become a kind of essentialism itself. And so I really appreciate the way in which you argue that yes, religions undergo interpretation and revision, but that there are certain parameters within which they change. They can't just become anything. And so I just really want to compliment you on that. I enjoy your Twitter feed. I really appreciate the voice, that what you contribute to these kind of public discussions. I'm not sure my comment really gets at the meat of your presentation, but I wanted to just kind of respond to something you said at the beginning about kind of understanding this current surge of nativism and white nationalism as a reflection of, Ross Douthat's idea of kind of our being in a post-Christian era. And I think, there may be something to his idea. I'm a little bit agnostic on it, but I'm not sure we have to kind of appeal to that in order to understand what's going on here. And I think sometimes we suffer from a lack of kind of historical perspective. This is not the first time in American history when there has been a kind of surge of nativism, white nationalism in response to major demographic changes. I mean, you can just think about the early 20th century, the 19-teens, the 1920s, during the era of kind of mass immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, which actually led, to the kind of legislation that so far, the current administration has not been capable, this current administration has not been capable of doing a whole hell of a lot. But let's put it that way. They actually resulted in major changes to an immigration law in the early 1920s. And I certainly don't think we would refer to that period. I mean, who knows, maybe, there were certain ministers who referred to a kind of decline of religion. But I think, looking back on it, we wouldn't necessarily refer to that period as a post-Christian era. So I'm just, kind of tossing that out, that there may be other changes that have taken place, in terms of technology and social media, the ability of, candidates to go around, some of the kind of the former middlemen in terms of the press, in terms of reaching and mobilizing an audience that might help us just as much as kind of appealing to a kind of decline of religion. Although I'm not ruling that out, and I think that what you have to say about the role of religion in serving as a kind of social cement is very important. So it's been a long-winded comment.
Well, thanks for the comment and the kind words too. And so I would say, so I think there's two parts to the answer. I mean, first of all, we're having this discussion at a time when we thought we had moved beyond fundamental or foundational ideological divides. So I'm thinking about this very much in a kind of post-1989 sensibility that, and this is also, the kind of technocratic moment, if you will, of center-left, center-right in the 1990s and 2000s in much of Europe, but also to some extent in the US, we can say, that I think that there was a sense that we wouldn't go back to ideological passions, at least among, elites, let's say. And the fact that we have has been confounding for a lot of people, and that's why there's a lot of debate about how we came to the moment that we find ourselves in. And that fits in obviously to kind of Fukuyama's work about the end of history, but also I think in a lot of political theory and philosophy, this idea of historical progression, which is oftentimes not explicitly stated, but I think it's an implicit part of how we talk about the world that we live in. We just always assume that, and that's why progressives are called progressives in part, right? Because they think that progress never ends, and we keep on moving in a particular direction in some kind of teleological fashion. And even the fact that Obama relied so often on, which started to really grate on me, I have to say, towards the end of his second term, the arc of history bends towards justice. And I think that was instrumentalized and used by Obama in ways that were counterproductive, but also unrealistic and out of place and out of time. And I think that it's interesting that, but I think that, so that's part of it, the time period that we're talking about. It seems odd, at least to many people, that we would have a resurgence of ethno-nationalism now, in particular. But I think also another difference is that if we look at the early 20th century, but even if we go back to the Civil War, racial divides were very much seen through the lens of sort of biblical interpretation and of Christianity. So there wasn't this sense that there was a white nativist movement that was unmoored from Christian theology. And actually, I think that if, I'll just mention because I read it recently and it's an amazing book. So a book like This Republic of Suffering, which talks about the art of dying, if you will, during the Civil War, and how central Christianity was to both sides, even to the extent that it was almost unquestioned as a sort of organizing principle, certainly for the North in a kind of abolitionist sense, but also for the creation of Confederate nationalism. So Christianity was front and center in a way that it doesn't seem to be in the kind of European-style ethno-nationalism that we see in the Trumpist part of the Republican coalition, but also particularly, I would say, in Europe, and perhaps European movements are more relevant for kind of making that case, because obviously there, it's a bit more stark in being unmoored from kind of Christian thought and theology. So I kind of offer that as sort of a tentative response.
Yes, my name is Javier Garcia, and I came from Cuba, as a religious worker 10 years ago. I continue working in church here, especially Hispanic in Central America and Latin America. But you see, I agree 100% with what you are saying. I like to listen to the opinion of the professor, about nationalism and all that. But we have white victimization today in the United States. People cannot say that's not true. It's true. We have white victimization, and and populism, and a part of the immigration policy of the United States. People came from East Europe to the United States, in 1990, 1991, 1992. All that first generation from East Europe, they grow up here. They become very educated people, and and the thing is that in some way they feel minority. In some way they feel also discriminated. And and the thing is because maybe they believe that we have white poverty, for the situation that we have with bank, the financial situation. You see that today, what you say, we don't have solidarity. If you go to Central America, the situation that they have there, it is that they bring a bank with money to help in El Salvador, help in Guatemala, Honduras, but you don't see solidarity. What the socialist people did in the Soviet Union a long time ago, that they bring people and they try to help, etc., does not exist. You don't get anything free. In El Salvador, if you build capitalism, in Guatemala, if you build capitalism, it's a bank who came and put interest, and they pay $250 a month to you, and that says capitalism. You know what I mean? But the thing is, the thing that I like to ask you, what is the answer that you have? How you define anarchism today in this society?
Anarchism.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Well, so I'll just say something about white victimization, because that's a very important point you raised. That, and this sort of fits into the previous question as well. That why are demographic concerns such a big, either implicit or explicit part of our conversation? I think what is also new is that one out of the two parties, for better or worse, has pretty much made the argument, and I think that I felt this myself, and I'll admit that I supported Hillary and I really wanted her to win, even though I had major issues with her campaign and part of what she stood for, still, but the fact that there was this sense of stronger together, that was the campaign slogan. And it was implicit there, but also it would be explicitly stated by people on the left, which is essentially that, hey, white people are basically a problem, and they can be overcome by forming a coalition of minority and disadvantaged groups, and if enough of them come together and have enough voter turnout, they can make sure that resurgent white identity does not win the election for the Republicans. But I think that sort of backfired in a way, in that if you're, and I'm obviously, as you could tell, not white, so I can only, so I'm just trying to understand one possible interpretation of that kind of thing. That if a party is telling you that you are a problem, or a potential problem, and that you might be, or people in your community might be deplorable, and that demographic, and this would be an argument for a permanent Democratic majority, and there were even books about this, essentially saying that if you play out demographic trends and immigration fertility rates, whites will become a minority. And so there is, I think that can kind of contribute to some of these fears in the sense of, I'll just sit here because it's
yeah. If I may ask, after you've asked your question, please turn off your microphone, which can contribute to
it's also nice for me
feedback.
Nice for me to sit down. Is this working or?
I don't know if these are turned.
Okay.
Turned on.
Okay. Should I just?
Yeah.
Let's try it.
I think we can still hear you if you'd rather sit.
Okay.
It's better for the video.
For the recording. Yeah. So.
Let's see if that helps.
Okay. Is that? Yeah. I think it's fine now.
Yeah.
So so that's one thing. On anarchism, I don't think I really have a great answer for you on that. I can't claim to have studied anarchist political theory all that much. But if you're talking about something a little bit broader than that, about kind of a loss of social stability, a kind of sense of chaos, and perhaps that can contribute to sort of a sense of things being anarchic in a sort of broader sense. Then I think that many of us probably do feel that. Although I was reading a piece, I think it was maybe earlier today or yesterday, making the case that if we actually compare protests and riots and sort of civil conflict, of outbreaks of violence, as bad as our current moment seems, it's still nothing compared to the late 60s and early 70s. So that's hard for me to relate to since I wasn't alive, and I think pretty much most people in this room weren't alive as well. So I think there can be a distorting sort of influence on how we view things because we lived in a time where things seemed relatively stable. So what we have today in our Trumpist era seems really radical and really destabilizing, where if you had lived through the late 1960s, or in Europe, lived through 1968, you would have been like, hey, we've been through this before, and actually, back then, it was still significantly worse.
I'm David B. Logic. I teach American art history and American studies as well. And when you began your talk, I think rightly said Trump is the most secular president in modern history, and yet somehow he's managed to instrumentalize religion to the degree that it feels like a theocracy. In a sense, he still goes through certain rituals, like there was that famous Oval Office gathering of, I think, white evangelical ministers that had a laying of the hands on the president. So you still have this sort of performative, going through the rituals that feels theocratic, even if he's not, individually going to church every, Sunday. And of course, he's now supporting somebody like Roy Moore, who wants to make the Ten Commandments sort of the governing instrument of the U.S. Constitution and so forth. And so, as somebody who contributes to Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, I don't feel like it's, like we're home free of the secular world of, we're, to the degree that we're, living in sort of still a kind of a theocratic moment. It seems like we are. In the same way that, you think of Vladimir Putin sort of instrumentalizing the Orthodox Church to reinforce his authoritarian power.
Right. So I think that, for at least one of the two parties, there will always be a temptation to instrumentalize religion because it's still a pretty big part of the voter base for the GOP does respond to religious appeals. That said, I would make a distinction between the kind of performative aspects of religiosity versus the actual content or substance. And perhaps here my point of comparison leads me in a different direction as someone who has studied Islamist movements, that there it's not just about performative religiosity, it's actually also about refashioning the state in some ways and Islamizing the state, Islamizing institutions, and Islamizing society in quite, at least potentially profound ways. We don't have a lot of test cases because Islamists generally haven't been able to govern that long. But still, we're talking about also more broadly speaking, religiously conservative societies where no one will even self-define as secular. So take Libya or Egypt. The word for secular is almost, verboten in the kind of public debate. Where here, I think, what I think really animates people like Rod Dreher, Ross Douthat, or Russell Moore even, in talking about a post-Christian society is that even though one political party is religiously influenced, the broader culture in terms of mainstream culture, mainstream media, art, culture, music, pretty much everything that we see on the national level is not just secular, but increasingly secularizing. And in, that's a sense that leads some Christians to feel that they don't have a place in the public debate. Now, whether we think that's fair or not is a different issue. We might say, that's irrational. You guys are, or academia, I should say too, is another sort of, in terms of cultural and intellectual production, where religious voices, and particularly Christian evangelical voices, are not particularly welcome. So I think it's understandable if you were, say, a Christian evangelical and you were looking at what you see on TV, what you read in the New York Times, what you see produced from universities, and you don't see any voices really representing the way you look at the world. And I'll just mention this too, because this is where I think the civilizational, the religious, and the identity all kind of overlap in a very interesting way. If you remember, it seems actually like a very long time ago, but I think it was only 2 weeks ago where John Kelly did the briefing. It seems so far away from my memory, which only goes to show how much has happened and why it's really hard for us to stay focused in our current news cycle. Because I remember listening to John Kelly. This was about the controversy around Trump speaking to the relatives of fallen soldiers. It really seems like a different world. It's incredible now that I'm trying to even like summon up the memory of it. And it was one of the most fascinating rhetorical performances I've perhaps ever seen from a senior U.S. official. I remember listening to General Kelly and being like, wow, is this really happening? And not even being able to process it. But you might remember he had this little riff, which was a kind of radical reactionary riff of sorts, where he said something along the lines of, oh, when I was growing up, when women were sacred, when religion was sacred, and he goes through a list of what was sacred, things, and essentially what he's calling forth, and it doesn't have to do with whether or not General Kelly himself is a particularly conservative Catholic or anything like that, but a kind of like religion was part of the American sense of honor and identity, and that's what he was really calling on. And I would just recommend for those of you who didn't see it, to kind of go back to it and look at how the rhetoric is being deployed. But it sort of fits into this, this broader civilizational frame of things were different then, and now our culture has become decadent. Nothing is sacred. And I think he didn't say this, but essentially this is sort of, it gets to the broader sort of point of view that we hear from these quarters. People, marriage as an institution isn't what it was used to. Everyone, gay people are getting married. Now transgender people are calling for their rights, which we might see as major signs of progress, but in a particular part of the country is seen as very disorienting, that the things that were held to be part of tradition or sacred are simply not taken seriously or not taken as sacred by the culture writ large. And I think that's what General Kelly, for better or worse, was really trying, what I think in his own way, as far as I could tell, was speaking to.
We have time for one more question. I'd like to ask it from a student.
Hi, my name is Yuna Sergi. I'm a senior in the Elliott School, and I'm writing my senior thesis on sectarianism in Lebanon. And we spoke of this ideological vacuum that has been left behind by this, or left from this post-Christian society. And on the flip side, we look at societies where religion is used to impose on all of society. Do you have an example of a state that has that perfect balance of using religion as a useful ideology without becoming too much, or is that an impossible standard to hope for?
Well, so it depends what you value, and I think it's hard to say, so I have my own particular bias from a political theory standpoint. First of all, I'm a democratic minimalist, which is a minority opinion, I think, to some extent, in the sense that for me, the procedural aspects of democracy are not just important, but are almost in a sense sacrosanct. And part of that is because of my time living and working and researching in the Middle East. that I saw what happened when even the procedural aspects of democracy were pushed to the side. And when you don't have that, you have no way to resolve conflict. So when people say, well, democracy is a means to produce substantive outcomes, I understand that, but for me, democracy is absolutely necessary because it's a way of managing conflict peacefully. And that without it, we have no way to resolve or even debate or discuss foundational or fundamental divides in our societies, whether they're ideological, religious, ethnic, or racial. There are other people who will prioritize other things more than I do and will say, well, democracy is less important. The most important thing is the classical liberal tradition. And if that means prioritizing liberalism over small L liberalism over small d democracy, so be it. So depending on where you come out on that particular debate, you might see certain societies as more preferable than others. I think the U.S., generally speaking, has been pretty good in this regard, although obviously now there are perhaps considerable tensions. But I think that if we're comparing the American model of public religion to how European countries have approached religion, I would argue the U.S. approach has been more successful, particularly when it comes to integrating religious minorities. So when you look at why is there a bigger issue in Europe when it comes to Muslim minorities, part of it, say in France, as I alluded to earlier, is that it's hard to be both fully French and fully Muslim simultaneously. There's almost an expectation that you have to choose what's more important to you. Are you more French or are you more Muslim? Because if you're a conservative Muslim and you wear the headscarf, then you will not be accepted by the broader French society as being fully French, because you will be seen as contravening the sort of secular norms of French society. Where I think one thing that, and I don't want to get all sentimental about the American dream and all that, but the fact that you can be fully Muslim but also fully American and not be forced to choose between those two identities, I think that's been one aspect of the American idea that has helped people like my parents integrate into American society. No one told them they had to choose between identities. And I think there's something, and I hope we don't lose that, and I think one of my fears, and perhaps the fear of other minority groups, including Muslims in particular, is that that might be lost in this kind of current move towards anti-Muslim, Islamophobic sentiment that's part of the bigger kind of ethno-nationalist, I think, development in this country. I'll also just say that Lebanon is a very interesting case, and I only mention this because you work on Lebanon, and Lebanon gets a lot of grief for being sort of a failed state, and obviously they went through quite a long civil war, so there is that history. But I would say Lebanon today, at least, is probably the most successful failed state in the world. And that's something. That's better than the alternative oftentimes. If you're choosing between that and say Iraq or Syria or Libya or Yemen, or even for that matter Egypt, then, if that's what you got to choose between, then the Lebanese model is a very intriguing one. And I think it's unfortunate there hasn't been as much discussion about the kind of, I guess you can say, I don't know what you would, the sort of sectarian pluralist model where every community is able to sort of express its collective identity, and there's a kind of respect for the boundaries of other communities, and no one religious community is allowed to supersede the others, which sort of does draw on some of the themes of consociational democracy that sort of became prominent in continental Europe when there were still bigger foundational divides. Belgium is a country that still sort of has this kind of this communitarian pluralist approach, if you will. Anyway, the point being that Lebanon does actually stand out to me, oddly enough.
Well, at the Loeb Institute, we encourage sentimental and misty-eyed appreciation for American ideals. So we'll stop there. I want to thank you for joining us, and also to thank Shadi Hamid for his remarks. We have some drinks lobby, so the conversation does not have to end. Thank you very much.